Alright, today we're going to be covering Prometheus and Atlas, another book written by Jason Rizzo-Giorgiani, like Prometheism, which is a book I looked at last video. Now this book is handling a similar theme, it's also handling the broad Prometheist movement, but whereas Prometheism is more so a general overview of the movement, and most of the philosophy there is relegated to the first chapter, Prometheus and Atlas, it's a much more rigorous, a much more dense book, and it has quite a bit of detail. It really demands a second reading. I originally read it right after having read Prometheism, but I didn't really understand it until having gone through it a second time, and that's what Nassim Taleb says is the mark of a really good book, so I'd say that's a good sign. Anyway, the subsection of the book I'm going to be looking at right today is it handles science and its relationship to reality itself. Science here it's more like knowledge. It's more like the Aristotelian view of science as pursuit of truth in general. Not really tied to the scientific method or any particular institutions, none of that. And Giorgiani's analysis of science, of knowledge, it starts out looking at paradigms, which are, I'd say, the theoretical basis that makes it possible to grasp facts in the first place. There's no brute or theory-neutral facts. Everything that we observe, every observation that we make, even every reasoned conclusion that we come to, that is colored by a paradigm that makes reality meaningful, makes reality significant or graspable in the first place. Now, the idea of paradigms was sort of brought to the forefront, brought to interest by the philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, who's a very significant philosopher. He wrote a book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is where a lot of the content we're going to be looking at here comes from, where he analyzes paradigms and paradigm shifts significantly. So, what's a paradigm shift? A paradigm shift is essentially, movement from one to another, a transition. Pretty obvious, it's in the title. And Thomas Kuhn believed that they're affected by what he called an empirical crisis. So, anomalies end up accumulating with your paradigms in this worldview. Let's say you believe in geocentrism, and it starts to become apparent that certain meteorological or astronomical observations just don't correspond to your worldview. That's an empirical crisis. Once enough of those anomalies pile up, then your paradigm starts to be replaced by other paradigms. Now, so far, that sounds a lot like what you'd get if you asked kind of a naive scientism, Neil deGrasse Tyson sort of person, what they thought caused paradigm shifts. They would say something like that. They would say something like, well, when the model stops matching the facts, we change the model. But that's not the entirety of Thomas Kuhn's system. He rebukes that naive scientism in that those new paradigms that form in those moments of crisis, they themselves don't form rationally. They don't form empirically. They're irrational and non-empirical. So, a couple consequences come out of that, and I'm going to quote Giorgiani here. He says, 1, observations are always theory-laden. We already came to that earlier. That's sort of a premise of paradigms in general. 2, the meaning of a term within a theory is given by the context of the entire theory, and thus a lack of shared meanings does not allow scientists of different paradigms to communicate with one another. So the way you could interpret this is that when two scientists have totally incommensurate worldviews, there's no way for them to talk meaningfully about the same terms. Epicureans have a word called prolepsis that they use to refer to this. It basically means before we've even started rationally engaging on a topic, we have a certain concept of what words like cow, man, red, etc. mean. We have certain ideas that are prejudgments or preconceptions that are necessary for rational discourse in the first place. And if you have incommensurate paradigms, that's not really possible. It's not possible to talk about those concepts meaningfully. Now, 3, there are no extra paradigmatic standards that can decide between scientists who advocate different paradigms. Basically, what this is saying is that the only facts you could use to judge a given paradigm are facts interpreted through that paradigm or a third one, and then that third one would need to be justified or agreed upon for it to be admissible in the first place. Finally, 4, there cannot be any cumulative progress toward truth in the transition from one paradigm to another, but only through puzzle solving within each paradigm. What's being said there is that because paradigms are formed non-empirically and irrationally, there's no reason to expect that over the course of transitions from one to another that we're getting closer to the truth. All that we can expect is that as we make progress within a given paradigm, that we're getting closer to the truth that that paradigm will make possible, or that that paradigm considers significant. Now, in what we've looked at so far, it looks like Thomas Kuhn does a good job rebuking that naive scientism mentioned earlier, and shows that that's not sufficient. That judgment that we just tend towards truth over time, that is insufficient. But Thomas Kuhn also says that those paradigmatic differences, the paradigmatic differences between, say, a geocentrist and a heliocentrist, well, he says those are just, quote, the result of neural processing fully governed by physical and chemical laws. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because he's saying that outside of a paradigm, outside of any given paradigm, there is a substrate that unifies the differences between any two paradigms. That means that there are such things for him as objective, brute, theory-neutral facts that you can use to observe the differences between paradigms. It's just that for him, that objective fundamental substrate is the brain, the neurochemistry, neurons and dendrites in your head. Maybe if you want to be a little bit extreme, your limbic system as a whole, but fundamentally it's just your brain. That limits him to the current dominant paradigm, right? What is the current dominant paradigm? It's materialism, it's physicalism, it's reductionism down to atoms. And that's something that he's not able to escape, and it's the degree to which he's insufficient. You need to go beyond Kuhn to get a full understanding of how paradigms work. So, where do we go for that? Well, we go to Phi Arabind. He's another philosopher of science. He wrote a book, Against Method. He's also pretty well known, pretty popular, and he calls himself almost identical to Kuhn, but that's really selling himself short. He's distinct in two significant ways. First of all, he rejects that paradigms must reduce down to neurochemical variation, right? He's willing to violate the nomos, violate the currently acceptable, the currently dominant paradigm. So he's more transgressive in that way. And the second way that he's distinct from Phi Arabind is that he rejects that the cause of paradigm shifts in the first place is the accumulation of anomalies and the subsequent empirical crises that come out of that. That's what Kuhn believed caused it, but for Phi Arabind, he believes that new paradigms are themselves radically pragmatic, and that it doesn't come down to any rational empirical crisis. Because even though for Thomas Kuhn the formation of new paradigms is irrational and non-empirical, the thing that initiates those new paradigms is rational empirical. The fact that a given paradigm is insufficient and causes these anomalies, that is rational, that is empirical. Not so for Phi Arabind. He believes that the whole thing, start to finish, is pragmatic. So that's a much stronger rebuke of naive scientism. It rejects two things: the foothold, first of all, in the currently dominant materialistic paradigm, and second of all, any semblance of a real factual basis for transitions from one system to the next. But saying that paradigms are radically pragmatic, that forces us to ask the question, what does it mean to be pragmatic? What does it mean to say that these paradigms are pragmatic? Well, for this, we could continue to look at Phi Arabind, but Giorgiani brings up another interesting philosopher that I think flows more smoothly into a broader analysis. That philosopher is Michel Foucault, who's not a philosopher of science par excellence, but he did write a book, The Archaeology of Knowledge, that's sort of a paleoanthropological view of the philosophy of science. And there he presents the idea of a discursive practice. So, for him, he's looking at paradigms as if they're basically organisms that grow and evolve and start at a very underdeveloped state and then eventually end up at a gangrenous, sclerotic, overdeveloped state. And the most youthful, most underdeveloped stage of a paradigm is a discursive practice. Now, you can kind of analyze that into its constituent parts. The word discursive means dialogical. It has to do with a back and forth between people, and practice means practical. But a better definition would be the non-rational, even non-linguistic elements of human social existence that are necessary for human social existence in the first place. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that whenever we're engaging in a rational discourse, that discourse is contingent on a political set of structures, i.e. power structures, ritual context maybe. There's always an element of the political and religious, that is to say, when we're doing something rational. And that ties in very nicely to generative anthropology, which will help us recap this whole discussion in toto. And the way that GA connects to this is with something called the Grammatical Stack. Now, where a discursive practice is the set of practical things that correspond to a rational discourse and that are the necessary predecessor to it, in GA, the Grammatical Stack is sort of the totality of those things combined. It's the rational discourse, the political discourse, the ritual signing or discourse. That kind of gets a little bit more hairy, but it's all of those things combined. And really, any healthy, complete social engagement is an interplay between all of those elements. It's an interplay between the rational and the political and the ostensive or immediate or ritual elements of life. Now, it's the purview of GA to go through proving that there's this specific succession, that it starts with a ritual form that then becomes a political form, and then we finally end up at the rational form of speech. But you can see how nicely this corresponds to Michel Foucault. The idea here is that the declarative, it's called in GA, or the rational form of speech, is only useful, it's only significant, meaningful, and socially appropriate as the contingency to the political, as the contingency to the ritual elements of life. Respectively, those are the imperative and ostensive in generative anthropological language. Now, how is this meaningful? How is the ritual political context meaningful? Well, it's meaningful because those aren't just speech forms. It's not just political speech forms or ritual speech forms. There's a culture that corresponds to each of these. There's a sort of ostensive culture, which is ritual and religious. There's an imperative culture, which is hierarchical and political, and then there's a declarative culture, which is hesitant to accept any imperative orders, is hesitant to accept any hierarchy, very opposed to hierarchy in itself. Those are the three main cultures that correspond to those speech forms. And now we start to reach something that is much closer to Michel Foucault and the paradigmatic stuff we're looking at earlier, in that the final culture, the culture that can sustain paradigms, that is declarative culture, only exists out of the interplay of the previous forms, out of the interplay of the previous forms of human existence, of human being. So when we want to find the cause of succession from one paradigm to another, it doesn't make sense to start with empirical crises. It makes sense to start with the power structures, the political institutions, the ritual institutions. Perhaps there's a semi-religious context to different paradigm shifts, as we've seen unfold around us over the course of the previous few years. But those real, non-productive, material aspects of life, those are the significant motivating factors here. And it should start to become clear how this allows us to go outside of just epistemology, because there's many other things that kind of correspond to that Kuhnian reductionism from earlier, saying that, well, sure, you need a paradigm to observe stuff, but there is kind of something outside of paradigms. But there is a neutral objective worldview. For Kuhn, that's the neurophysiology of the brain. But there are many other instances of people doing this sort of half-in, half-out reductionism. Another video that I want to make sometime in the near future is one handling Marx, who does something very similar. In the contribution to the critique of political economy, he talks about how, and to this extent he agrees with David Graeber, who I'll compare Marx to here. He believes that our individual consciousnesses correspond to social forms. Obviously, Marx gets right that there isn't really any individual except in a societal context, in an environmental context. But much like Kuhn, he takes that correct observation and then shortstops it by saying, but there is a real non-social grounding for those social forms. It's what he would call the real productive material condition or stage of society. Now, David Graeber, who I'll compare him to, and I want to do a video at one point comparing that contribution to the critique of political economy to David Graeber's book On Kings, but for now, David Graeber agrees that our individual consciousnesses are at the very least conditioned by the environment that surrounds us. Where he disagrees is the idea that us living within the social context can even point to something like the real productive material conditions of society as something that is outside of that interplay between the social and the individual consciousness. He would say that the political is fundamental, and to assume that there is an objective, neutral basis you can look at outside of the political, outside of the environmental, social context that you're conditioned by, is to make the same error that Kuhn makes when he says, sure, paradigm's significant, but it's just the neurons and dendrites in your brain. It's just your limbic system, etc., etc. So, there's that similar motif there, which is interesting, and I want to analyze that at some point, because really, On Kings it's an originary book, and it's related to generative anthropology for that reason, but even though it's presenting anthropology and paleoanthropology through a different lens, it contrasts pretty nicely with the contribution to the critique of political economy. So, I will be analyzing that at some point in the future, as will I be other GA books. I've been recently rereading The Origin of Language, which is kind of the first popular generative anthropological book, and that is so detailed. There's so much stuff in there that just has to be covered. It's another one that, like Prometheus and Atlas, the second reading just gives you so much more than the first reading. Very good stuff, so I hope to do a little bit on that, but for now, I'm going to leave it off here, a shorter video that will serve as the basis for, you know, more detailed talks in the future about particular examples of this error, of this kind of reductionism, this unfounded reductionism, and of course also, I've only scratched the surface of Prometheus and Atlas, and there's so much there, especially the chapters, I think 4, 5, and 6 they are, which handle aesthetics. Those are incredibly dense, denser than these. That would take like 2 hours to talk about in completion, so I hope to talk about that, but for now, scratching the surface, and take care. That's all for today.